It was in the spring of 1897 that Mr. Edward Dunning, Fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and noted scholar of medieval liturgical texts, found himself in the cathedral town of Barchester, pursuing what he believed would be a routine examination of manuscripts. Dunning was a man of methodical habits and quiet temperament, unmarried, approaching his 45th year, with the slight stoop and pale complexion common to those who spend their days among books, rather than under open skies. His reputation in scholarly circles was modest but solid, built upon a series of careful papers concerning the development of English primers and books of ours during the 14th and 15th centuries. The invitation had come from Canon Worsley, librarian of Barchester Cathedral, who had written to inform Dunning of certain volumes lately discovered in the muniment room, volumes which, from the canon's somewhat vague description, might prove relevant to Dunning's current research into devotional practices of the pre-Reformation period. The canon's letter had been cordial if imprecise, mentioning several items of potential interest and extending an invitation to examine them at Dunning's convenience. It was this very imprecision that had piqued the scholar's curiosity, for Canon Worsley was generally known to be a precise man when describing matters of his collection. Barchester itself presented that peculiar combination of the ancient and the comfortable which characterizes so many of England's cathedral towns. The railway station, modern and efficient, gave way within a quarter-mile to streets that might have been laid out in Tudor times, winding between half-timbered houses and eventually ascending toward the great mass of the cathedral, which dominated the town from its elevated position like a shepherd watching his flock. Dunning had secured lodgings at the Mitre Inn, an establishment of considerable age situated in the shadow of the cathedral close, where the landlady, a Mrs. Merrick, proved herself both obliging and inclined to discourse at length upon local matters, a tendency which Dunning, being of a retiring nature, found somewhat wearying. It was on the morning following his arrival, after a breakfast of considerable substance, that Dunning presented himself at the cathedral library. The day was fine, with that peculiar clarity of light that spring sometimes bestows upon old stone, making the cathedral seem to glow from within its weathered gray surfaces. Canon Worsley received him in the library itself, a long room occupying the upper floor of what had once been the monks' dormitory, its windows looking out over the cloisters and the cathedral green beyond. The canon was a man of perhaps 60 years, spare and tall, with that particular variety of absent-minded courtesy that often marks the scholar who has spent too long among books and too little among men. After the usual pleasantries, he led Dunning to a table upon which several volumes had been arranged. "These are the items I mentioned in my correspondence," Worsley explained, his long fingers hovering over the books without quite touching them. "They were discovered only last month, you understand, when we were obliged to move certain shelving in the muniment room, behind a false panel. Whether deliberately concealed or merely forgotten, I cannot say. Most are of the usual sort, account books, a register of obits, that manner of thing. But this one," he gestured toward a volume bound in dark leather, smaller than the others, perhaps 8 inches in height. "This one is rather peculiar." Dunning drew the book toward him. The binding was indeed curious, of an age, he judged, with the 15th century, but the leather was of an unusual texture, almost reptilian in its appearance, and unpleasantly warm to the touch despite the coolness of the library. There was no lettering on the spine or cover, and the edges of the pages were blackened, as if the book had at some time been partially exposed to fire. "Have you examined it?" Dunning asked. "I confess I have not looked closely," the canon replied, and there was something in his tone, a hesitation, perhaps, or an evasion that caught Dunning's attention. "I thought it best to await someone with your particular expertise in such matters. The script is difficult." Dunning opened the book. The pages were of vellum, of good quality, and the hand was indeed challenging, a late Gothic script, heavily abbreviated, the ink a peculiar brownish red that reminded him uncomfortably of dried blood. The text appeared to be in Latin, but of a corrupt and irregular sort, mixed with passages in what might have been English or perhaps a dialect thereof. There were illustrations as well, crude but vigorous, depicting figures and scenes that seemed to belong more to the realm of nightmare. Then to any devotional purpose, extraordinary, Dunning murmured. This is certainly no ordinary book of ours. The iconography is most unusual. See here, this appears to be some form of conjuration, unless I am very much mistaken. Canon Worsley had stepped back slightly from the table. You believe it to be a book of magic, then? I should hesitate to use so dramatic a term, Dunning replied, his eyes still fixed upon the page. But it is certainly concerned with invocation of some sort. The usual protections are absent. There is no appeal to divine authority, no safeguards. Rather the reverse. In fact, this symbol here, he pointed to a figure drawn in the margin, a crude representation of what appeared to be a face with features that were somehow wrong in their proportions. I have seen something similar in a manuscript at the British Museum, a 15th century compilation of charms and incantations confiscated from a cunning man in Norfolk. But that was a crude affair compared to this. He turned several more pages, his fascination growing despite, or perhaps because of, a certain unease that had begun to steal over him. The book seemed to emanate a subtle wrongness, as if its very presence was an offense against the ordered calm of the library. Several times he found himself glancing over his shoulder, though he knew perfectly well that only Canon Worsley stood behind him, and the canon had moved to one of the windows and was gazing out toward the cathedral with an air of studied inattention. One page in particular arrested Dunning's examination. It contained a lengthy passage in the corrupt Latin, surrounding a full-page illustration of a figure, whether human or otherwise. It was difficult to determine. The drawing showed something crouched or huddled, wrapped in what might have been robes or perhaps its own limbs, the face hidden save for two eyes that the artist had rendered with particular care, so that they seemed to stare out from the page with an intensity that was positively disconcerting. Beneath the image was a caption in larger letters than the surrounding text, "Demon in Libro." The devil in the book. Canon Worsley, Dunning said slowly. What do you know of the provenance of this volume? How did it come to be in the cathedral library? The canon turned from the window, and Dunning thought he detected a certain relief in the man's expression, as if he were glad the book was no longer being examined. That is the difficulty, you see. There is no record of its acquisition. None whatsoever. It simply appeared, as it were, behind that panel, along with certain other items that were more readily identifiable, a 14th century psalter, some administrative documents from the dissolution period. But this book, it is as if someone wished to hide it, or perhaps to keep it contained. Contained. Dunning repeated the word with interest. A poor choice of expression, Worsley said quickly. I merely mean to suggest that its concealment was deliberate. Whether to preserve it from destruction or to prevent its use, I cannot say. Dunning looked down at the book once more. The eyes in the illustration seemed to follow his movement. He closed the volume with a snap that echoed in the quiet library. With your permission, Canon, I should like to take this back to my lodgings for closer study. I confess it has seized my interest, and I suspect it may prove a significant addition to our understanding of late medieval occult practices in England. He was surprised to find himself hoping the canon would refuse, but Worsley merely nodded, with what seemed like relief. By all means, I shall make a note of the loan in the register. I trust you will take proper care of it. Naturally, Dunning assured him, though as he wrapped the book in the cloth the canon provided, he could not entirely suppress a shudder at the warmth, the unpleasant, almost feverish warmth that seemed to emanate from its covers. The remainder of that first day passed without particular incident, though Dunning found his attention returning repeatedly to the wrapped volume he had placed upon the writing desk in his room at the Mitre. The chamber was comfortable enough as sitting room with an adjoining bedroom, situated at the front of the inn overlooking the street, with mullioned windows that let in the afternoon light, and offered a view of the cathedral's western towers. Mrs. Merrick had provided tea at 4 o'clock, along with an extended commentary upon the weather and the likelihood of rain, to which Dunning had responded with the minimal encouragement such discourse required. It was not until after supper, when darkness had settled over Barchester and the streets had grown quiet, that he finally unwrapped the book and set himself to a systematic examination of its contents. He had lit the lamp on his desk and drawn the curtains against the night. creating a small circle of light in which he and the book seemed isolated from the world beyond. The volume, he discovered, was more extensive than his initial examination at the library had suggested. It appeared to be a compilation, assembled over a period of years, perhaps decades, by multiple hands, though one scribe seemed to have been responsible for the greater portion of the text. The earliest entries, judging by the style of script and certain linguistic features, dated from the late 14th century, while the latest could not have been written after the middle of the 16th century. The subject matter was consistently concerned with what the various scribes termed the art of binding and commanding, a phrase that recurred with tedious frequency. What gradually became clear to Dunning, as he worked through the crabbed Latin and occasional English passages, was that the book purported to be a manual. For constraining the word imprisoning was also used entities of a spiritual or demonic nature. The theoretical framework, such as it was, seemed to draw upon a corrupt understanding of both Christian and pre-Christian traditions. There were instructions for the preparation of materials, the selection of suitable vessels, a term never clearly defined, and the performance of rituals designed to trap or bind the entity in question. The illustrations, which appeared every few pages, were consistent with this theme. They depicted various geometric figures, circles, triangles, pentagrams of unusual design, along with stranger symbols that Dunning could not identify. There were also representations of the entities themselves, or at least, he supposed, of what the artists imagined such beings to resemble. These figures were universally disturbing, rendered with a vigor that suggested the illustrators had found a kind of enthusiasm in their grotesque subject matter. Faces with too many eyes, or none at all, limbs that bent at impossible angles, forms that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which one viewed them. But it was the section he had noticed earlier, the page-headed demon in Libro, that commanded the greatest portion of his attention. Here the text was more extensive and, frustratingly, more difficult to decipher. The Latin was particularly corrupt, mixed with passages in what he eventually identified as Middle English of an East Anglian variety, and other phrases that seemed to belong to no language he recognized. What he could translate, however, was troubling enough. The passage described a ritual performed, so the text claimed, in the year 1487, by a priest whose name was given only as D.A. This individual, apparently motivated by some grievance against his ecclesiastical superiors, the nature of which was not explained, had attempted to summon and bind a spiritus malignans of particular power. The purpose was revenge, though again the specifics were vague. What was clear, and described in uncomfortable detail, was that the ritual had succeeded, perhaps too well. The entity summoned had indeed been bound, but not in the manner intended. Instead of being constrained to perform specific tasks, it had been imprisoned within the book itself, sealed in vellum and ink, as the text put it, that it might not walk abroad nor work its will upon the world. Dunning sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The hour was late past midnight, he realized with some surprise, and the lamp was burning low. The story was nonsense, of course, the ravings of a superstitious age, no more credible than tales of werewolves or vampires. And yet there was something in the detailed, matter-of-fact tone of the account that was more unsettling than the most florid Gothic romance. The writer believed what he was setting down. That much was clear. Moreover, there was a final passage that gave him pause. It was written in a different hand, and from the script Dunning judged it to be considerably later than the main text, perhaps as late as the 1540s. It consisted of only a few lines, but they were explicit in their warning. Let him who reads take heed. The binding holds but weakly now. Already there have been signs. 3 times has it sought to break free, and 3 times have we renewed the seals. But we grow old, and there are none to follow us in this work. I have hidden this book where it may not be found, and I pray God it shall remain hidden until the ending of the world. For if the devil in the book should once more walk, none shall be safe from its malice. A sudden sound made Dunning start in his chair, a scratching, as of something drawn across the window glass. He turned quickly toward the curtains, his heart beating rather faster than was comfortable. The sound came again, more distinctly, a definite scratching, as of claws or nails. He rose and crossed to the window. pulling back the curtain with what he hoped was firmness despite the tremor in his hand. Beyond the glass, illuminated by the lamplight from within, was nothing but the empty street and the bulk of the cathedral beyond. No cat perched on the sill, no tree branch swaying in the wind. The night was perfectly still. Dunning let the curtain fall and stood for a moment, willing his pulse to slow. A rat, perhaps, somewhere in the walls, or the old building settling, or any one of a dozen perfectly natural explanations. He glanced back at the book lying open on his desk, and for a moment, only a moment, he could have sworn that the eyes in the illustration were directed toward him, though he knew perfectly well that when he had last looked at the page, they had been gazing straight ahead. He closed the book firmly and placed it in the drawer of the desk. Then, feeling rather foolish, but doing it nonetheless, he locked the drawer and pocketed the key. He would continue his examination in the morning, in the daylight, when such fancies as assailed him now would seem as absurd as they truly were. But sleep, when he finally sought it, was long in coming, and troubled when it came. Morning brought the reassurance of daylight and the mundane sounds of the inn. Coming to life, footsteps in the corridor, the clatter of crockery from below, voices raised in commonplace exchanges about breakfast and the prospects for the day. Dunning rose, performed his ablutions, and descended to the dining room with his equanimity largely restored. The fears of the night seemed precisely what they were, the products of an overactive imagination, working upon suggestive material at an unsuitable hour. He had experienced similar effects in the past when working late upon medieval texts, those chronicles of plague and persecution, of visions and wonders, that could prey upon the mind when one's critical faculties were dulled by fatigue. After breakfast, he determined to spend the morning in further exploration of Barchester and its environs. The book could wait. Indeed, a period of detachment would likely prove beneficial, allowing him to return to it with a clearer head and a more objective perspective. Canon Worsley had mentioned, in passing, certain features of the cathedral that might interest a scholar of Dunning's particular focus, and there was also the matter of the cathedral library's other holdings, which he had barely begun to investigate. The day was fine, with a freshness in the air that spoke of spring's steady advance. Dunning made his way through the cathedral close, observing with appreciation the well-maintained lawns and ancient trees that surrounded the great building. The close itself was typical of such precincts, a collection of canonical houses, dating from various periods, some medieval, others added in later centuries, all arranged in a rough semicircle round the open green. A few clerics moved about on their morning business, and Dunning exchanged nods with those he passed, though none seemed inclined to conversation. He entered the cathedral through the west door and spent a profitable hour examining the nave and transepts. The building was largely of the 13th century, with later additions and modifications that did not materially detract from the harmony of the whole. He paid particular attention to the choir stalls, which featured misericords of considerable artistry depicting scenes from Scripture and also, as was common, certain grotesque figures and beasts that owed more to folk tradition than to Christian iconography. One in particular caught his eye, a figure that seemed to be emerging from, or perhaps being drawn into a large book held by an angel or perhaps a monk. The carving was worn, but the essential outlines were clear enough, and Dunning found himself thinking of the illustration he had seen the previous night. The demon in libro, impressive, are they not? Dunning turned to find a clergyman standing nearby, a man of perhaps 50 years with a round, pleasant face and the comfortable girth that suggested an appreciation for Mrs. Merrick's breakfasts and their equivalents. Indeed, Dunning replied, "I was particularly struck by this one. Do you know anything of its significance?" The clergyman he introduced himself as the Reverend Mr. Palmer. One of the cathedral's minor canons examined the misericord with the air of one who has looked at it many times before. Curious, isn't it? The usual interpretation is that it represents the Word of God as both refuge and judgment. The book is sanctuary and prison, as it were, though I confess I have sometimes wondered if the carver had something more specific in mind. There are local legends, you know, about books and their dangers. But then, every cathedral has its legends. What sort of legends? Dunning asked, trying to keep his tone casual, Palmer smiled. Oh, the usual Gothic nonsense. Tales of monks who delved deeply into forbidden knowledge. Books that brought madness to those who read them, that sort of thing. Every generation adds its own embellishments. There's one tale in particular about a priest of the old religion before the Reformation. You understand, who was said to have trapped some manner of demon or devil in a book, supposedly to prevent it from harming the faithful. Though knowing the ingenuity with which such stories are constructed, I suspect the priest's motives were rather less altruistic in the original version. And what became of this book? Dunning inquired, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lost, naturally. Or destroyed, or hidden. The details vary depending on who tells the tale. My own theory is that it's a confused memory of the dissolution, when many Catholic books and relics were indeed destroyed or concealed to prevent their loss. Folk memory being what it is, such events become transmuted into supernatural narratives. But I don't suppose that interests you. You're staying at the Mitre, Kennan Worsley mentioned, here to examine manuscripts. Dunning confirmed that this was so, and the conversation moved to safer, more scholarly grounds. But as he took his leave of the Reverend Palmer and continued his tour of the cathedral, he found his mind returning to the legend. A priest who trapped a devil in a book that was then hidden. And now, after for centuries, that book had been found. He told himself, firmly, that the correspondence was coincidental, that folklore attached itself to any object of mystery, and that books were particularly apt to accumulate such accretions, that the volume he had examined was nothing more than a curiosity, a historical artifact with no more power than any other collection of parchment and ink. And yet, as he made his way back to the Mitre for luncheon, he found himself taking a route that kept him in the open streets, avoiding the narrower lanes and shadowed passages, and twice he looked over his shoulder, though each time there was nothing there save the ordinary traffic of a market day, in an English country town. It was after lunch, as he climbed the stairs to his room, that he encountered Mrs. Merrick descending from the upper floor. The landlady's usually cheerful countenance was troubled, and she stopped when she saw him. "Oh, Mr. Dunning, sir, I'm that sorry. I hope you'll not think less of my housekeeping, but I must tell you there's been some manner of disturbance in your room." Dunning felt a cold presentiment settle over him. "What sort of disturbance?" "I'm sure I don't know how to describe it, sir. The maid went in this morning to make up the room, as is usual, and she found—" "Well, you'd best see for yourself. Nothing's been taken, so far as I can tell, but there's papers scattered about and such. I've not touched anything, thinking you'd want to see it as it is." He climbed the remaining stairs with a sense of dread that he could not entirely rationalize. The door to his sitting room stood open, and as he entered, he saw immediately what Mrs. Merrick had meant. His papers, the notes he had been making on the cathedral manuscripts, his correspondence, various documents he had brought with him from Cambridge were scattered across the floor, as if swept from the desk by a violent hand. Books had been pulled from the small shelf and lay tumbled in a heap. Even the cushions from the chairs had been disturbed, but it was the desk that drew his attention. The drawer in which he had placed the book, the drawer he had locked, stood open, and the book itself lay on the desk, open to the page he had been examining the night before. The page with the illustration, "The Demon in Libro." "I assure you, sir, the door was locked when Jane came up," Mrs. Merrick was saying from the doorway. "She has the master key, of course, for the cleaning, but she swears the room was secure, and there's been no one else on this floor all morning. I cannot account for it." Dunning barely heard her. He was staring at the book, at the illustration with its crouched figure and staring eyes. The drawer had been locked. He had the key in his waistcoat pocket even now, and yet the drawer was open, and the book was out, and open to that particular page. He became aware that Mrs. Merrick was still speaking, apologizing, offering to send for the constable. He turned to her with an effort. "No, no, that won't be necessary. Nothing has been taken, as you say. Perhaps I was careless with the lock. These old keys can be temperamental. If you would be so kind as to have the maid attend to the room, when I've had a chance to restore order, I should be grateful." Mrs. Merrick departed, clearly still troubled but evidently relieved that he was not holding her responsible. Dunning closed the door behind her and stood for a long moment, regarding the chaos of his room and the book lying open on the desk. There was, he told himself, A rational explanation. There had to be. Perhaps he had not locked the drawer properly. Perhaps there was some defect in the mechanism that had caused it to spring open. Perhaps the maid herself had opened it, though for what purpose he could not imagine, and had been too frightened to admit it when she saw the result. He crossed to the desk and looked down at the book, and as he did so, he could have sworn, though he knew it was impossible, knew it was merely a trick of the light or of his own disordered nerves, that the eyes in the illustration moved, just slightly, just enough to track his movement across the room. He closed the book with hands that shook despite his efforts to steady them, and this time, he wrapped it in cloth and placed it in his trunk, which he locked securely. The key he placed on a chain around his neck, where he could be certain it would remain until he chose otherwise. But even as he began to gather up his scattered papers, he could not shake the conviction that he was no longer alone in the room, that something was watching him, waiting, and that the true disturbance had only just begun. For the remainder of that day and the whole of the next, Dunning attempted to maintain his usual routine, dividing his time between the cathedral library and his lodgings, making notes on the various manuscripts Canon Worsley had assembled for his inspection. But his concentration was imperfect. His mind returned again and again to the book locked in his trunk, and to the question of what had occurred in his room. He had, upon reflection, decided against mentioning the incident to Canon Worsley. What could he say that would not make him appear either credulous or deranged? That a book had apparently removed itself from a locked drawer? That he suspected some supernatural agency was at work? The canon would quite reasonably conclude that the London scholar had been working too hard, or perhaps had indulged too freely in Mrs. Merrick's excellent port on the third day of his stay. Dunning resolved to learn what he could about the book's history through more conventional channels. If it had indeed been hidden in the muniment room since the Reformation or at any time during the cathedral's long existence, there might be some record of its presence, some reference in the archives that would illuminate its provenance and perhaps explain the unease it provoked. Canon Worsley proved accommodating when Dunning expressed an interest in consulting the older cathedral records. "You'll want the chapter books," he explained, leading Dunning into a back room of the library where ranks of leather-bound volumes lined the walls. These contain the minutes and decisions of the cathedral chapter from the establishment of the dean, and chapter after the Reformation. Before that, of course, Barchester was a monastic foundation, and those records are rather more fragmentary. We have some account rolls, a few obedientiaries records, that sort of thing, but nothing like a complete archive. Dunning began with the chapter books from the 1540s, the period immediately following the dissolution. The volumes were well preserved, the handwriting generally clear, though the organization left something to be desired. He worked through entries concerning appointments, property disputes, repairs to the fabric, and the myriad other administrative matters that occupied the attention of any cathedral chapter. It was tedious work, but Dunning was accustomed to such labor. Much of scholarship consisted of precisely this kind of patient searching through unpromising material. It was late in the afternoon, with the light beginning to fail, when he found the first suggestive entry. It was dated September 1547, and recorded a meeting called to address what was described as certain disquieting occurrences in the north transept of the cathedral. The nature of these occurrences was not specified, but the chapter had decided to engage a man of learning and good repute to investigate. The name given was that of Dr. Henry Ashton, identified as a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, a reassuringly academic credential that made Dunning feel an unexpected kinship with this long-dead predecessor. A later entry, from November of the same year, noted that Dr. Ashton had completed his investigation and submitted a report. The chapter had accepted his recommendations and ordered that certain materials of an unwholesome nature be secured in a place where they would pose no danger to the faithful. There was no further detail, but appended to the entry in a different hand a note added, Dunning judged, at a considerably later date, was a single line. The book was sealed in the wall behind the chapter room, that it might trouble us no more. Dunning sat back, his pulse quickening. This was it, surely a reference to the very book he had examined. The chronology was right. The description, vague as it was, matched. And most significantly, there was that word, sealed, the same term used in the book itself to describe the binding of the entity within its pages. But who was Dr. Henry Ashton? And what had his report contained? Dunning looked through the remainder of that volume and the ones immediately following, but there was no further mention of either Ashton or the materials he had dealt with. The report itself, if it had ever been preserved, was not among the chapter books. It was Canon Worsley, consulted as he was preparing to close the library for the evening. Who provided the next piece of the puzzle? Dr. Ashton. Yes, I know something of him, not from our records, but from my own research into the early post-Reformation period. He was rather a noted figure in his time, a scholar of Hebrew and Greek, author of several theological works, fellow of kings, as you say. But his later career was troubled. He seems to have developed certain peculiar interests. There were rumors never substantiated. You understand that he dabbled in what was then called natural magic, though I suspect it was simply that his scholarship ranged into areas his more orthodox colleagues found uncomfortable. What became of him? Dunning asked. That's the sad part. He died quite young, at only 43 years of age, in 1553, I believe. The circumstances were somewhat mysterious. He was found dead in his rooms at Cambridge, and while the official conclusion was natural causes, there was apparently some speculation that he had been driven mad by his studies. Contemporary accounts mention that his chambers were found in a state of considerable disorder, with books and papers strewn about. But you know how such stories accumulate around scholarly types who stray from the conventional path. I dare say the truth was far more mundane. Books and papers strewn about, like Dunning's own room 3 days earlier. The parallel was too striking to dismiss. Yet what could it possibly mean? That Ashton had also been troubled by whatever presence dwelt in or with the book. That his death was somehow connected to his investigation of those unwholesome materials. Dunning thanked the canon and made his way back to the Mitre through streets that seemed to have grown darker than the hour warranted. Lamps were being lit in windows, and here and there a late shop was closing for the evening. Ordinary sights, commonplace activities. Yet Dunning felt as if he were moving through a world that had become subtly unfamiliar, where the comfortable surfaces of everyday life overlay something far stranger and more threatening. At the inn, he dined alone in his room, having no stomach for Mrs. Merrick's conversation. The trunk containing the book stood in the corner, innocent and inanimate, yet he found himself avoiding looking directly at it. Instead, he sat by the window as the last light faded from the sky, watching the cathedral bulk grow dark against the stars, and thinking about Dr. Henry Ashton. What had Ashton discovered in his investigation? What had he recommended? And why had the chapter acted upon his advice with such apparent urgency? And most troubling of all, if the book had been sealed away in 1547, intended to remain hidden until, as that later note had put it, the ending of the world, what did its rediscovery portend? He rose and, after a moment's hesitation, unlocked the trunk and removed the book. He carried it to the desk and opened it once more to the page headed Demon in Libro. But this time he read with greater care, forcing himself to work through the difficult Latin word by word, making notes as he went. What emerged was a narrative both more specific and more disturbing than his initial reading had suggested. The ritual of 1487 had been performed, according to the text, by a priest named David Ash, the DA of the earlier reference. Ash had been the sacrist of the monastic community that preceded the Reformation cathedral, responsible for the sacred vessels and vestments. He was described as a man of learning, but also of pride, who had been passed over for advancement despite what he clearly regarded as his superior merits. His grievance had focused particularly on the prior, a man named Richard Mallon, whom Ash blamed for his lack of preferment. The summoning ritual had been intended to bring about Mallon's downfall, through supernatural means, a disease, perhaps, or an accident that would seem natural, but would in fact be the work of the entity Ash had called forth. But the ritual had gone awry. The entity summoned had proven too powerful to control. Rather than submitting to Ash's commands, it had turned upon the summoner himself, and would have killed him. The text was quite explicit on this point had Ash not, in desperation, performed a second ritual. This one had trapped the entity not in the physical world, where it could work mischief, but in the very book from which its summoning had been read. The book had become its prison, the vellum and ink its walls and bars. But the confinement was not perfect. The text made this clear. The entity retained some measure of power, some ability to influence the world beyond its prison. Those who read the book, who looked upon the illustration and spoke the words written therein, risked giving it a foothold in the world once more. And if the conditions were right, if someone with sufficient knowledge, or power, or simply sufficient ignorance were to perform the necessary actions, the entity could break free entirely. What those actions might be, the text did not specify, or rather, it specified them in terms so obscure and elusive that Dunning could make little sense of them. There were references to threefold opening, and the reader who becomes the reed, and the binding loosed by the bound. It was the language of ritual and mysticism, infuriating in its opacity. One passage, however, was perfectly clear. It was a warning, written in the same later hand that had added the note about concealing the book. Let him who thinks to use this book for his own purposes know that he does not command what is written herein. Rather, it commands him. The devil in the book seeks always for release, and he is patient beyond the measure of mortal understanding. He will wait decades, centuries if need be, but he does not forget, and he does not forgive those who imprisoned him. And when he finds one foolish enough to give him entrance to the world once more, his vengeance will be terrible beyond imagining. Dunning closed the book and sat for a long moment, staring at nothing. The lamp flame flickered, casting moving shadows on the wall. From somewhere in the building came the sound of a door closing, footsteps on stairs, the ordinary noises of an inn at night. He had always prided himself on his rationality, his skepticism regarding the supernatural. He was a scholar, a man of the 19th century, trained in the rigorous methods of modern research. Ghost stories were for children and credulous servants. The supernatural belonged to the realm of folklore and superstition, not to the world of verifiable fact. And yet, here in this quiet room, with the book before him and the memory of those scattered papers still fresh in his mind, he found his certainties wavering, not because he had witnessed anything that could not be explained by natural causes. He had not really, but because the cumulative weight of suggestion, the concatenation of circumstances, had begun to work upon his mind in a way he found difficult to resist. He thought of Dr. Henry Ashton, dead at 43, his rooms found in disarray. He thought of the warning written for centuries ago, by someone who had clearly believed in the reality of the threat. He thought of his own room, disturbed in a manner that still defied rational explanation. And he thought of the illustration in the book, those eyes that seemed to watch and wait. With an effort of will, he wrapped the book once more and returned it to the trunk. But as he prepared for bed, he found himself leaving the lamp burning low. And when sleep finally came, it brought dreams that were confused and troubling, full of whispered voices speaking in languages he could not understand, and of a presence that moved just beyond the edge of vision, always watching, always waiting for its moment to emerge. The following morning brought a letter from Cambridge, forwarded by his college. It was from a colleague, Dr. Matthews, responding to an inquiry Dunning had sent some weeks earlier regarding certain obscure references in medieval manuscripts. Matthews's letter was characteristically thorough, but it was the postscript that caught Dunning's attention. You asked also about David Ashe, sacrist of Barchester in the late 15th century. I have found a reference to him in a letter from the period, written by one John Nettleton, a merchant of Norwich, to his brother. Nettleton describes visiting Barchester in 1488 and witnessing what he calls a great commotion at the monastery. Apparently, Ashe had been found dead in the sacristy under circumstances that were considered suspicious. The writer hints at dark practices and suggests that Ashe had meddled with powers beyond Christian ken. The prior ordered that Ashe be buried in unconsecrated ground outside the monastery walls, and his possessions were to be destroyed or locked away. Whether this Ashe is the one you're interested in, I cannot say, but the chronology would seem to match your period of study. Dunning read the postscript 3 times, so Ashe had died shortly after performing his second ritual, the one that had imprisoned the entity in the book. Had the entity killed him, or had the effort of the binding itself proven fatal? The text in the book had not mentioned Ashe's death, But then, it would not have, if the account had been written before that event occurred. And there was another troubling implication. If Ash had been buried in unconsecrated ground, his spirit might itself be restless. Might he, too, be somehow connected to the disturbances? Or was Dunning simply allowing his imagination to construct elaborate fantasies? From fragments of historical data, he decided to visit the cathedral again, to see if there were any records of where Ash had been buried. It was a tangible research goal, something to occupy his mind with concrete investigation rather than morbid speculation. Canon Worsley, when consulted, proved helpful. Burials outside the consecrated ground? Yes, we have records of such things, though they're rather scattered. Before the Reformation, the monks kept lists of burials in the cathedral and its precincts. Those who were buried elsewhere suicides, excommunicates. That sort of unfortunate were sometimes noted separately. Let me see what I can find. He disappeared into the recesses of the muniment room and emerged a quarter of an hour later, with a ledger bound in crumbling leather. This is the Liber Mortuorum from the monastery period. It's not complete, but it does include a section on what they called sepulturae extra muros, burials beyond the walls. Let's see. 1488, you said. He turned pages carefully, running his finger down columns of names and dates. Ah, here. David Ash, sacrist, died in the year of our Lord 1488, in the month of January. Buried north of the church, beyond the wall, by order of the prior. May God have mercy on his soul. Well, that's rather more charitable than one might expect for someone buried in unconsecrated ground. Can you determine where, exactly, he was buried? Dunning asked. Worsley looked thoughtful. The north side, beyond the wall. That would have been. Well, the cathedral's been much altered since the monastery days, but I believe that area would now be part of the garden behind the deanery. There's an old wall there, late medieval I should say, which might well be the one referred to. I can show you, if you like. They walked together through the close to the deanery, a handsome Georgian building that had been erected on the site of the prior's lodging. The dean was away, Worsley explained, visiting his son in London, and the house was closed up save for a caretaker. They went around to the rear, where a garden stretched away toward a high stone wall gray with age and mottled with lichen. That's the wall, Worsley said, pointing. It marks the northern boundary of the cathedral grounds. Beyond it is simply meadow church land still, but not part of the cathedral close proper. If Ash was buried outside the wall, it would have been in that meadow. They walked to the wall and examined it. It stood perhaps 7 feet high, solidly built, with a gate that was currently locked. Through the bars of the gate, Dunning could see the meadow Worsley had mentioned, a flat expanse of grass dotted with wildflowers, apparently used for grazing, as several sheep were visible in the distance. I don't suppose anyone knows exactly where he was buried? Dunning asked. I doubt it. 500 years is a long time, and graves in unconsecrated ground were rarely marked. The meadow's been used for various purposes over the centuries. Any marker that might have existed would be long gone. Dunning stood looking out over the meadow, trying to imagine it as it would have been in 1488. A winter burial, the ground frozen, perhaps. A small party of monks performing the minimum necessary rites for a man who had died under a cloud of suspicion and supernatural dread. Had they known what Ash had done? Had they understood the danger of the book he had created? There's a local tradition, Worsley said suddenly, that the meadow is haunted. Children sometimes claim to see a figure walking there at dusk, a monk, they say. Though how they would know it's a monk I cannot imagine, as they've probably never seen a monk's habit. The usual sort of folklore that accumulates round old ecclesiastical sites. I mention it only because you seem interested in such historical curiosities. Has anyone reported seeing this figure recently? Dunning asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Not that I'm aware of, though I confess I don't pay much attention to such tales. Why do you ask? Simple curiosity, Dunning replied. But as they walked back toward the cathedral, he found himself glancing back at the meadow, half expecting to see something moving there. Some figure in dark robes pacing restlessly across ground that had never been sanctified. That evening, back at the Mitre, he opened the book once more. He was beginning to feel that he needed to understand it more fully, to comprehend the nature of what it claimed to contain. The illustrations, he now noticed, followed a progression. In the early pages, the demonic figures were shown as separate from the human forms depicted alongside them summoner, and summoned, distinct and clearly delineated. But as one moved through the book, the boundaries became less clear. The figures began to merge or overlap. In one particularly disturbing image near the middle of the volume, a human form was shown with its mouth open, and emerging from that mouth was something else, something with eyes like those in the demon in Libro illustration. The implication seemed clear enough. The entity could inhabit a human body, speak with a human voice, work through human hands. The prison of the book was not absolute. Given the right circumstances that the text infuriatingly refused to specify clearly. It could extend its influence into the world. And then there were the marginal notes, written in various hands over the centuries. Most were in Latin, but some were in English, and one was in what Dunning identified, with some surprise, as Greek. They were warnings, mostly, from various readers who had studied the book and been alarmed by what they found. One note, written in a 16th century hand, was particularly chilling. I have dreamed for 3 nights running of the thing in this book. It speaks to me in my sleep, promising me knowledge and power if I will but speak the words written on page 47. I dare not even look at that page again. I have resolved to return this book to the cathedral authorities and recommend most strongly that it be destroyed. But even as I write this, I feel a great reluctance to part with it. It has wound itself about my thoughts like a serpent, and I fear I may not have the strength to let it go. There was no indication whether the writer had succeeded in returning the book, but the very existence of the note suggested that the book's influence was real, or at least, that those who studied it believed it to be real, which amounted to much the same thing. Dunning turned to page 47. Curiosity overcoming caution. It contained a ritual of some sort, written in the corrupt Latin he had come to recognize. The purpose was not entirely clear, but the opening words were a direct invocation. I call upon thee who art bound within these pages. He closed the book quickly, a wave of irrational fear washing over him. He had not spoken the words aloud, had barely read them, and yet for a moment he could have sworn he felt something shift in the room, as if the air itself had moved in response to his attention. This was absurd. He was allowing superstition to master reason. The book was nothing more than a historical curiosity, a window into the beliefs of a more credulous age. The entity it claimed to contain was a fiction, a product of medieval fears and misunderstandings, and yet, as he prepared for bed, he found himself placing the book not back in the trunk, but on the desk, where he could see it from his bed, as if keeping it in sight somehow made it less threatening than leaving it hidden away, where it might do what? Emerge on its own, work some mischief unseen. He slept poorly, waking several times from dreams he could not quite remember, but which left him with a sense of profound unease. And once, toward dawn, he woke with the certain conviction that someone had been standing beside his bed, looking down at him. But when he lit the lamp with trembling hands, the room was empty save for himself and his scattered belongings, and the book, lying closed upon the desk, its dark binding absorbing the lamplight as if light itself could not quite touch its surface. The 6th day of Dunning's stay in Barchester dawned gray and overcast, with a dampness in the air that promised rain before evening. He woke feeling unrefreshed, his sleep having been troubled by dreams that lingered unpleasantly at the edges of memory, vague images of dark passages and whispered voices, of pages turning without hands to turn them, and always those eyes watching from the illustration, patient and malevolent. He took breakfast in the dining room, grateful for Mrs. Merrick's cheerful conversation about the weather and local affairs, mundane topics that helped restore his equilibrium. He had determined that today he would set aside the book and return to his original purpose in Barchester, the examination of the cathedral's other manuscripts. He needed to break the obsessive focus that had developed, to reassert his scholarly detachment. But as he was preparing to leave for the cathedral, there came a knock at the door of the inn, and Mrs. Merrick appeared to inform him that he had a visitor. It was the Reverend Mr. Palmer, the minor canon he had met in the cathedral several days earlier. Palmer entered with an air of apologetic diffidence. "Mr. Dunning, forgive me for calling without notice, but something has occurred that I thought you should know about. It concerns the book you've been studying, the one Canon Worsley lent you from the muniment room." Dunning felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Please, sit down. What has happened?" Palmer took a chair and seemed to gather his thoughts before speaking. "Last night, I was working late in the library. I have been cataloging some additions to our collection of sermons. It was past 11 o'clock when I prepared to leave. As I was descending the stairs from the library, I hesitate to describe it, for fear you'll think me either drunk or mad, but I distinctly heard someone reading aloud. The voice seemed to come from the muniment room, which I knew to be locked. What was being read?" Dunning asked, though he suspected he already knew. "That's the peculiar thing. It was in Latin, medieval Latin, I think, though I confess my Latin is rather rusty. But the cadence, the tone, it was not the sort of reading one would expect to hear in a cathedral at that hour. There was something unpleasant about it, something that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. I know that sounds melodramatic, but I assure you it is an accurate description of my response." "What did you do?" "I unlocked the muniment room and entered. There was no one there. The room was empty, locked from the outside as it should have been. But," he paused, clearly troubled, "Mr. Dunning, I am not a man given to fancies. I am by nature skeptical of supernatural explanations." But I could still hear the voice. It was fainter, as if coming from a great distance or from behind a wall, but it was still there. And it seemed to be coming from the area where the book was found, where that false panel conceals the space that had been walled up centuries ago. Dunning said nothing for a moment. Then, making a decision, he said, "Mr. Palmer, I think you should see the book. There are things you should know about it." He brought out the book from where he had placed it in his traveling bag. He had taken to carrying it with him, not trusting it to remain in his room unsupervised. Palmer examined it with interest, but Dunning noticed that his hands, like Dunning's own when he had first encountered the volume, seemed reluctant to touch it for long. Dunning explained what he had learned, the history of David Ash, the ritual of 1487, the claims the book made about containing an imprisoned entity. He half expected Palmer to laugh, to dismiss it all as medieval superstition. Instead, the clergyman's face grew increasingly grave. "This explains a great deal," Palmer said at last. "I should tell you, Mr. Dunning, that there have been other incidents. Canon Worsley did not mention them because he did not wish to alarm you. But the discovery of these manuscripts has been followed by certain disturbances. Books found out of place in the library, the sound of footsteps in empty rooms, and 3 nights ago, the verger found one of the side doors to the cathedral standing open, though he swears it had been securely locked. These things individually might be nothing. Old buildings settle, locks fail. People forget where they place things, but collectively, you think they are connected to the book. I think it is a possibility that cannot be dismissed, and after what I heard last night, I am inclined to believe that this is not merely a historical curiosity, but something that poses a genuine danger. What do you propose we do?" Dunning asked. Palmer considered. "The book makes certain claims about how the entity was imprisoned. Perhaps there are also instructions for ensuring that the imprisonment remains secure, or better yet, for destroying the book entirely. I have found no such instructions." Dunning admitted. "The text is obscure in many places, but it seems clear that the creator of the binding did not expect it to be permanent. It was a temporary measure, perhaps intended to contain the entity until some more effective solution could be found. Then perhaps that solution should be found now, before whatever is in this book grows stronger." They spent the remainder of the morning going through the book together, Palmer's knowledge of medieval Latin proving useful in deciphering some of the more obscure passages. What emerged was a picture both more detailed and more disturbing than Dunning's initial assessment. The entity, it was never given a name, being referred to only as it or the servant or, most commonly, demon, had apparently been summoned from some realm or state that the text could not clearly describe. It was not, strictly speaking, a demon in the Christian sense, but rather something older, something that had existed before Christianity and would exist after. It was a thing of malice and hunger, desiring above all to inflict suffering upon the living. Ash's ritual had called it forth but failed to bind it to his will. The creature had turned on him immediately, and would have killed him had he not, in desperation, performed the second ritual, the one described on page 47, which Dunning had glimpsed the previous night. This ritual had not destroyed the entity, but had instead trapped it within the very book from which it had been summoned, binding it to the pages and ink through a complex working that even the text itself seemed unable to fully explain. But the binding was imperfect. The entity retained a measure of consciousness and will. It could influence those who read the book, appearing in their dreams, whispering suggestions, slowly working upon their minds. And if someone were to read the full invocation on page 47, speaking the words aloud with intent and understanding, then it would be free. Palmer finished, his face pale. "Mr. Dunning, has anyone read that page aloud?" "Not in my presence," Dunning replied. "But last night, you heard someone reading in the muniment room." If the voice was coming from behind the wall where the book was hidden, they looked at each other with shared understanding and dread. The entity itself had been reading, speaking through the walls of its prison, attempting to make itself heard. And if it could do that, what else might it be capable of? It was Palmer who suggested they consult with Canon Worsley to inform him of what they had discovered and to seek his advice on how to proceed. They found the canon in his study, a comfortable room lined with books and overlooking the cathedral green. When they had explained the situation, both men conscious of how improbable their account must sound, Worsley listened with a seriousness that suggested he was not entirely surprised. "I had feared something of this sort," he admitted. "When we first discovered the book, I felt a profound reluctance to examine it closely. I attributed this to age, to fatigue, to any number of rational causes. But in truth, I believe I sensed that there was something wrong with it, something unwholesome. That is why I asked you to come, Mr. Dunning. I thought a scholar of your expertise might be able to determine its nature and advise us on how to deal with it. I believe," Dunning said carefully, "that we should consider destroying it." Worsley nodded slowly. "I am inclined to agree, but we must be careful. If the book truly contains what it claims to contain, simply burning it might not be sufficient. We might release the entity rather than destroying it." "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest we consult the one record that might provide guidance, Dr. Ashton's report from 1547. I said before that I did not know where it was, but that was not entirely accurate. I know where it should be, according to our cataloging system. I simply have not wished to look for it, for reasons I cannot rationally explain. But I believe the time has come to set aside such hesitations." They went together to the muniment room, and Worsley led them to a cabinet containing documents from the immediate post-Reformation period. He searched through several boxes before finding what he sought, a sheaf of papers bound with a ribbon that had once been red, but had faded to a brownish pink. "Here," he said, handing them to Dunning. "Dr. Ashton's report to the chapter, dated November 1547. Dunning untied the ribbon carefully and spread the pages on a nearby table. The document was written in a clear secretary hand, though the ink had faded to a pale brown. He began to read, Palmer and Worsley looking over his shoulders. The report began with a description of the phenomena that had troubled the cathedral. Voices heard in empty spaces, objects moved without visible agency, and most disturbing, several members of the cathedral community who reported being visited in their sleep by a figure in the robes of a monk, a figure with a face that was somehow wrong, as if it were a mask imperfectly fitted to what lay beneath. Ashton had investigated thoroughly, interviewing witnesses, examining the cathedral's records, and eventually tracing the disturbances to the area near the sacristy. He had discovered certain documents among the possessions of David Ash, the sacrist who had died under suspicious circumstances 60 years earlier. These documents revealed Ash's dabbling in forbidden practices and his creation of what Ashton called an accursed book. The book itself had been found hidden in Ash's former quarters. Ashton had examined it and concluded rightly. Dunning thought that it represented a genuine danger, but rather than destroying it, Ashton had recommended that it be sealed away, for to destroy the book without proper preparation would be to release that which is contained within it, and the danger of such release would be greater than the danger of preservation. He had performed a ritual of his own, one designed to strengthen the binding and ensure that the entity could not escape. The book was then to be placed in a sealed chamber behind the chapter room, where it would remain undisturbed. Ashton had warned that the book must never be opened, must never be read, must never be subjected to direct light if possible, and he had added a final, chilling caution: should the book ever be discovered and brought forth again into the world, it must be dealt with most carefully. The binding I have placed upon it will hold for a time, but it is not eternal. Eventually, the entity will find a way to influence those around it, to work upon their minds, to seek its freedom. If this should occur, the book must be resealed immediately. Using the procedure I have here set forth, the procedure followed, written in Ashton's own hand and requiring materials and knowledge that were, Dunning realized with sinking heart, quite beyond their ability to obtain or employ. "We cannot do this," he said flatly. "The ritual he describes requires items we do not have, herbs that may no longer even be known by the names he uses, symbols to be drawn with pigments of specific composition, and incantations in what appears to be Enochian or some similar artificial language." "Then what do we do?" Palmer asked, his voice tight with strain. It was at that moment that they all heard it, a voice, distant but distinct, speaking in rhythmic cadence, speaking Latin, speaking the words of an invocation, and it was coming from the direction of the mitre inn. They ran as much as men of their respective ages and conditions could be said to run through the cathedral close and into the streets of Barchester. Dunning led the way, his heart pounding not merely from the exertion, but from a terrible certainty that something had gone dreadfully wrong in his absence. He had left the book in his room, locked in his traveling bag. But if the entity could influence minds, could work through dreams, could speak through walls, the inn stood quiet in the gray afternoon, giving no outward sign of disturbance. Mrs. Merrick was at her usual station, behind the desk in the entrance hall, and she looked up in surprise as the three men burst through the door. "Mr. Dunning, whatever is the matter?" "My room," Dunning gasped. "Has anyone been in my room?" "Why, no, sir, not since Mary made it up this morning." "Is something wrong?" But Dunning was already mounting the stairs, Palmer and Worsley close behind. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to fit it into the lock. The door swung open, and the room was empty. No sign of disturbance, no figure standing over his possessions, no voice chanting forbidden words. Everything was as he had left it. The traveling bag sitting on the chair where he had placed it that morning. "I don't understand," Palmer said from the doorway. "We all heard it, didn't we?" That voice. Dunning crossed to the window and pulled back the curtain. The street below was empty save for a woman with a basket and a dog nosing about near the corner. Everything appeared perfectly normal. And yet the three of them had heard that voice, clear and unmistakable, speaking words that should not be spoken. It was Worsley who noticed it first. "Mr. Dunning," he said quietly. "Your bag." Dunning turned. The traveling bag sat where he had left it, but the straps were undone, and the flap hung open. He had fastened it securely before leaving. He was certain of it. He approached the bag slowly, with a dread he could not name. Inside, visible through the opening, was the dark leather of the book's binding. He reached in to remove it, and as his fingers touched the leather, he felt that same unpleasant warmth he had noted on first encountering it. But now it was stronger, more pronounced, as if something within the book had awakened and was radiating heat like a fever. He lifted it out and placed it on the desk. The book lay closed, innocent in appearance, yet all three men instinctively stepped back from it. "Look at the pages," Palmer whispered. Dunning looked. The edges of the pages, visible where they protruded beyond the binding, were no longer the uniform brown of old vellum. They were darker along one edge, as if scorched. And as he watched, though this surely had to be a trick of the uncertain light, they seemed to darken further, the blackness creeping inward like a stain. "It's burning," Worsley said, his voice hushed with horror. From the inside, Dunning forced himself to open the book, turning to the page headed Demon in Libro. The illustration was as he remembered it, the crouched figure with its hidden face and terrible eyes. But something had changed. The figure seemed larger somehow, occupying more of the page, as if it had shifted position during the hours the book had lain closed. "And the eyes, they're looking at us," Palmer said, stating what all three of them could see but none wished to acknowledge. "They're following our movement." It was true. As Dunning moved slightly to the left, the eyes in the illustration tracked him. When Palmer shifted position, they swiveled to focus on him. It was impossible. It was absurd. It violated every principle of natural philosophy, and yet it was happening. Undeniably, before their eyes. "We must take action," Worsley said, his scholarly calm fraying at the edges. "This has gone beyond mere historical curiosity. Something is happening. Something is building. Can you not feel it? The very air in this room seems thick, oppressive." Dunning could indeed feel it. There was a pressure in the room, a sense of imminent. What? Release? Manifestation? He could not find the words to describe it, but the sensation was undeniable. Something was trying to break through, to push its way from the prison of the book into the world beyond. And then, as clearly as if someone had spoken directly into his ear, Dunning heard a voice read the words. "Speak the invocation. Free me, and I will give you knowledge beyond the dreams of mortal scholars. I will show you secrets hidden since the foundations of the world. All you must do is turn to page 47 and read what is written there." He jerked back from the book as if scalded. "Did you hear that?" From the expression on Palmer's face, he had. Worsley simply nodded, his complexion having gone gray. "It's speaking to us," Palmer said. "Dear God, it's actually speaking to us. We must leave," Dunning said, making a decision. "We must get the book out of this room, away from people. Somewhere it can do no harm while we determine what to do with it." "Where?" Worsley asked practically. "Where can we take it that would be safe?" Dunning thought rapidly. "The meadow behind the deanery, where Ash is buried. If the entity has any connection to Ash, perhaps that location would, I don't know, contain it somehow. Or at least, it's away from the town, away from people who might be influenced." It was a thin hope, based more on desperation than logic, but none of them had a better suggestion. Dunning wrapped the book in the cloth, though he could feel the heat of it through the fabric. They descended the stairs, Dunning offering a hasty explanation to Mrs. Merrick about having to return to the cathedral. And then they were out in the street, moving as quickly as dignity would allow toward the cathedral close. The afternoon had grown darker, though whether from gathering clouds or from some effect of what they carried, Dunning could not say. The streets seemed emptier than usual, or perhaps people instinctively drew back as they approached, sensing that something was wrong. Several times Dunning felt the bundle in his arms shift slightly, though he knew or told himself that this was merely his own trembling communicated to the book. They reached the deanery and made their way around to the rear garden. The gate in the old wall was still locked, but Worsley produced a key. He had the keeping of all the cathedral's keys, and they passed through into the meadow beyond. The grass was damp from recent rain, and the afternoon light lay gray and flat across the open space. The sheep had been moved to another pasture, and the meadow was empty save for the three of them. Dunning carried the book to approximately the center of the space, Worsley and Palmer following. "Here," he said, and placed the bundle on the ground. "We need time to think, to plan. Perhaps if we leave it here, the influence will be weaker. We can—" He never finished the sentence, because at that moment, the bundle moved, not with the small shift of something settling, but with a definite, purposeful motion, as if something inside it was trying to get out. They all saw it. They all took a step back. And then the cloth fell away, seemingly of its own accord, and the book lay exposed on the grass. It opened, though there was no wind to open it, and the pages began to turn, one after another, flipping rapidly as if someone were searching for a particular passage. The pages stopped at page 40-7. The voice came again, but this time it was not in their minds. It emanated from the book itself, speaking the words of the invocation, the ritual that would break the binding and free what lay within. "We must stop it," Palmer cried. "We must close the book. Must." "No." Worsley grabbed his arm. "Ashton's report said it must never be interrupted once it begins to speak. To interrupt it might break the binding without our intent, might release it uncontrolled. We must let it finish and hope the binding holds." They stood frozen, listening to that terrible voice speaking words in a language none of them fully understood, a language that seemed to twist and corrupt the very air through which it passed. The sky above had grown darker still, And Dunning realized with a shock that night was falling, but far more rapidly than was natural. It was as if the light itself was being drawn toward the book. Consumed by whatever presence dwelt within its pages, the voice rose to a crescendo, and the book began to glow, not with the warm light of a lamp or candle, but with a cold, blue-white radiance that hurt to look upon. The grass around it withered and blackened, and Dunning could smell something burning, though there were no visible flames. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The voice fell silent. The glow faded. The book lay still and ordinary upon the blackened grass. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Worsley stepped forward cautiously and nudged the book with the toe of his boot. It did not react. He bent down and, with obvious reluctance, picked it up. "It's cold," he said, surprised. "Cold as ice. Is it over?" Palmer asked. "Has the binding held?" "I don't know," Dunning admitted. "I don't—" He stopped, because he had seen something move at the edge of the meadow near the old wall. A figure, barely visible in the gathering darkness. A figure in dark robes, its face hidden, moving with a slow, gliding gait that seemed wrong somehow, as if it were not quite touching the ground. "Look," he whispered, pointing. They all turned. The figure had stopped and was standing perfectly still, as if aware that it had been observed. At this distance, Dunning could not make out any details, but he had the impression of something waiting, watching, considering Dot, and then it moved toward them, and they could see its face, or rather, where its face should have been, for there was nothing there but shadow, deep and absolute, save for 2 points of light that might have been eyes, the same eyes as in the illustration, the eyes that had watched from the page. The devil in the book had found a way to walk. They ran. There was no consultation, no debate. The primal instinct for survival took over, and they fled back toward the gate in the wall. Behind them, Dunning could hear something following, though the sound was wrong. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of rustling, sliding noise, like fabric being dragged across stone. Worsley reached the gate first and fumbled with the key. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped it, and Palmer had to retrieve it from the grass while Dunning stood with his back to them, facing the approaching figure. It was closer now, perhaps 30 yards away, and in the failing light, he could see details that made his breath catch in his throat. The robes it wore were monastic in style, but they hung wrong, as if there were no solid body within them. And where the hands should have been visible at the ends of the sleeves, there was only darkness, the same absolute darkness that obscured its face. It moved without hurry, with the confidence of something that knew its prey could not truly escape. "Got it." Palmer's voice cracked with relief as the lock finally turned. They stumbled through the gate, and Worsley slammed it shut behind them, turning the key with such force that Dunning feared it might break off in the lock. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from beyond the gate, came a sound that Dunning would remember for the rest of his life: a low, rasping exhalation that might have been breath, or might have been laughter. "The gate won't hold it," Worsley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will it?" "I don't know," Dunning admitted, "but we cannot remain here. We need to—" He was interrupted by a violent rattling of the gate. The iron bars shook in their frame, though nothing visible touched them. The sound echoed across the garden, and lights began to appear in the windows of the deanery. The caretaker, roused by the commotion. "The cathedral," Palmer said suddenly. "We must get to the cathedral. Consecrated ground, holy sanctuary. Surely it cannot follow us there." It seemed as good a plan as any. They ran across the garden and through the close, the book still clutched in Worsley's hands. Behind them, the rattling of the gate continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then there came a sharp crack, like wood splintering, and Dunning knew without looking that the gate had given way. The west door of the cathedral stood open. It was always left open until the evening service, a tradition dating back centuries. They plunged through into the nave, and Palmer seized the great iron ring and pulled the door shut. It closed with a boom that echoed through the vast space. The cathedral was dim, lit only by the fading daylight through the windows and a few lamps that had been lit in preparation for evensong. The verger appeared from the direction of the choir, an elderly man named Marsh, his face expressing alarm and confusion at the sight of the 3 disheveled clergymen. Who had burst so unceremoniously into his charge? Gentlemen, what on earth? Lock the doors, Worsley commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. All of them. Every entrance to the cathedral. Do it now, Marsh, and ask no questions. The verger hesitated only a moment, then hurried off. Palmer sank onto one of the benches that lined the nave, his face pale and drawn. Dunning stood staring at the west door, half expecting to see it burst open at any moment. What have we done? Palmer asked quietly. What have we unleashed? We have done nothing, Dunning replied, though he was not entirely convinced of this. The book has been trying to break free since it was first created. Our only fault was in discovering it and allowing it to be brought into the light. Then the fault is mine, Worsley said heavily. I should have listened to my instincts. I should have had it destroyed immediately, whatever the risk. Instead, I asked you here, Mr. Dunning, and placed you in danger. I placed all of us in danger. Recriminations serve no purpose, Dunning said, forcing himself to think clearly despite the fear that clutched at his chest. We must focus on what to do now. The entity has manifested. It has found a way to take physical form, or at least the appearance of such form. But it was still bound to the meadow, to the place where Ash was buried. Perhaps the binding is not entirely broken. Then why did we run? Palmer asked. If it cannot leave that place, I said perhaps. I do not know for certain. But the fact that it did not pass through the wall immediately, that it needed to break the gate, suggests that barriers still have some effect on it. And if barriers of wood and iron have effect, then surely the consecrated walls of a cathedral should provide even greater protection. He hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. In truth, he had no idea whether the cathedral's sanctity would prove any defense against what they had encountered. The entity was not a demon in the Christian sense the text had made that clear. It was something older, something that predated Christianity and owed no allegiance to its symbols and sanctities. Marsh returned, slightly out of breath. All the doors are locked, Canon. I've sent the curate to ensure no one enters for the evening service. Shall I send for the dean? The dean is in London, Worsley reminded him. Marsh, I need you to do something else. In the library, on the second shelf of the manuscript cabinet, there's a box containing documents from the 1540s. Bring it here, quickly, and bring lamps, as many as you can gather. We need light, as much light as possible. As the verger hurried away, Dunning turned to Worsley. Why the documents? What are you thinking? Dr. Ashton's ritual, the one he used to strengthen the binding in 1547. We cannot replicate it precisely, as you noted, but perhaps we can adapt it, use what we have available. The cathedral itself is a kind of seal, is it not? Built on consecrated ground, dedicated to the service of God. If we can perform some version of Ashton's working here, within these walls, we might be able to restore the binding, or at least hold the entity at bay until we can find someone with the knowledge to deal with it properly. It was desperate reasoning, but Dunning could think of nothing better, and in the meantime, they needed to understand what they were dealing with more fully. He took the book from Worsley and sat down on one of the benches, opening it once more to the section describing the entity's nature and the original binding. As he read, a picture began to emerge, one more complete and more terrible than he had previously grasped. The entity was not merely malevolent. It was malevolence itself, a thing that existed only to cause suffering and despair. It fed on fear and pain, and it had been starving in its prison of vellum and ink for 400 years. Now, tasting freedom, it would be ravenous moreover. It bore a particular grudge against those who had imprisoned it. David Ash was long dead, but the book itself remembered. And Ash had been associated with this cathedral, with this place. The entity would be drawn here not merely by their presence, but by old hatred and the desire for revenge against the institution that had contained it. We are not safe here, Dunning said slowly, looking up from the page. In fact, we may have made a grave error. The cathedral is not sanctuary, it is the very place the entity most wishes to desecrate. We have delivered ourselves into its domain, as if in response to his words. There came a sound from outside the building. It started as a low vibration, barely audible, but quickly grew louder, a resonant hum that seemed to come from all directions at once. The air itself began to vibrate, and Dunning felt the bench beneath him trembling. What is that? Palmer whispered. The sound grew louder still, and now it was accompanied by other noises, scratching at the doors, a rattling of windows, and beneath it all, that rasping exhalation they had heard in the meadow, magnified 100-fold until it filled the cathedral like the breathing of some enormous beast. And then, impossibly, the west door began to open. Slowly, as if pushed by an invisible hand, it swung inward despite being locked. Marsh's key still protruded from the lock, turning of its own accord. The lamps. Worsley shouted to the verger, who had returned with the box of documents. Light them all now. Marsh fumbled with matches, lighting one lamp, then another. The light pushed back the shadows, and for a moment Dunning dared to hope that it might be enough. But then he saw what was entering through the west door, and hope died in his breast. It was the figure from the meadow, but changed. Larger now, more solid, as if the time since they had fled had allowed it to draw more strength, to give its form more substance. The robes still hung strangely, but beneath them Dunning could now see the suggestion of a shape, something hunched and twisted, not quite human. The face was still obscured by shadow, but the eyes blazed with a cold, malevolent intelligence. And behind it, following it into the sacred space, came others, shapes less distinct than the first, mere suggestions of form, made of shadow and malice, but numerous. They flowed through the door like smoke, spreading out into the nave, moving along the walls and ceiling with that same wrong, gliding motion. Stand together, Worsley commanded, his voice steady despite the terror written on his face. Do not let them separate us. They drew close, forming a tight circle round the lamps, the book lying open on the bench beside them. The shadows advanced, and Dunning could feel the temperature dropping precipitously. His breath came in white clouds, and frost began to form on the stone pillars of the cathedral. The lead figure, the one that had worn Ash's robes, though whether it was Ash's spirit or the entity itself using that form, Dunning could not say, stopped perhaps 10 yards away. It stood perfectly still, and then it spoke. The voice was not like the one they had heard reading from the book. That had been cold but somehow impersonal. This was hideously intimate, speaking directly into their minds with words that seemed to bypass the ears entirely. You have tried to contain me. You have tried to bind me with your symbols and your words. But I was old when your gods were young. I have waited, patient beyond your understanding of patience. And now I am free, and you will pay the price for centuries of imprisonment. You are not free. Dunning heard himself say, though his voice shook. The binding still holds. You can manifest, but you cannot act fully in the world. That is why you need someone to speak the final words, to complete the release. And we will not do so. The figure's response was something between a laugh and a snarl. Will you not? Already I have worked upon your minds, visited your dreams, planted seeds of thought that will grow in time. One of you will speak the words. One of you will complete what has been begun. It is inevitable, never, Palmer said, his voice firmer than Dunning would have expected. We would die first. Death. The entity seemed to consider this. Death is nothing. A transition, a doorway. I can show you things far worse than death. I can show you despair that has no ending, fear that has no surcease. I can make you long for death as a drowning man longs for air. It raised one shadowy appendage, and the lesser shapes began to move closer. Dunning felt something cold touch the back of his neck, not a physical touch, but the sensation of being brushed by something that existed slightly outside the normal dimensions of space. He heard Palmer cry out beside him, and saw Worsley stagger as if struck. And then, from the book lying open on the bench, came a brilliant flare of light, not the cold glow they had seen in the meadow, but a warm, golden radiance that drove back the shadows. The entity recoiled, and its voice rose in a screech of rage and pain. Dunning looked down at the book in astonishment. The page was no longer the one describing the entity. Instead, it had fallen open to a different section, one near the end of the volume that he had not noticed before. The text was in Latin, written in yet another hand, and it was not an invocation or a binding. It was a prayer, a simple prayer of protection, the kind that might be found in any medieval book of ours. But it was working. The light grew brighter, and the shadows fled before it like darkness before the dawn. The entity's form wavered, becoming less substantial. and for a moment Dunning could see through it to the cathedral door beyond. Ashton. Worsley breathed. This must have been Ashton's edition. A safeguard, placed in the book itself, activated by genuine faith in the presence of genuine evil. Read it, Mr. Dunning. Read the prayer aloud. Dunning did not hesitate. He lifted the book and began to read, his voice growing stronger as the words flowed. Palmer joined him, and then Worsley, the three voices blending in the ancient Latin phrases. The light from the book intensified until it was painful to look upon, and the entity's screech rose to a pitch that threatened to shatter the cathedral's windows. And then, abruptly, it was gone. The shadows vanished, the cold dissipated, and the three men stood alone in the nave with only the flickering lamps for illumination. The book's light had faded, leaving only the ordinary pages visible once more. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Palmer sank to his knees, whether in relief or thanksgiving, Dunning could not say. Worsley stood with his head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer, and Dunning himself felt a weakness in his limbs that threatened to send him to the floor. But he forced himself to remain standing, to examine the book, to ensure that the danger had truly passed. The page with the prayer still lay open, and he read the final lines that appeared below the Latin text. They were in English, and in Ashton's hand, I have placed this protection within the very vessel of evil, that if the binding should ever weaken, those with faith might use it to drive back the darkness. But know that this is only temporary. The entity cannot be destroyed by mortal means. It can only be contained, and each time it manifests, the binding weakens further. If you who read this have witnessed what I have witnessed, you will understand what must be done. The book must be sealed again, sealed more securely than before, in a place where it can never be found. This is the only way. Dunning closed the book slowly. The danger had passed, but Ashton was right. They had only driven it back, not destroyed it. And next time, for there would be a next time if the book remained in the world. The binding might not hold at all. We know what we must do, he said quietly. The question is, do we have the courage to do it? They remained in the cathedral until dawn, none of them willing to venture out into the darkness. Marsh brought them blankets and tea, accepting with admirable composure Canon Worsley's explanation that they were engaged in research of a sensitive nature that required them to remain with the manuscripts overnight. The verger was clearly unconvinced, but he was too well trained in ecclesiastical deference to press the matter. Dunning spent the long hours studying Ashton's report in detail, comparing it with the text in the book, trying to understand exactly what would be required to reseal the volume securely. The task was daunting. Ashton had used materials and methods that were no longer readily available. The herbs he mentioned mandrake prepared in a specific manner. Vervain gathered under particular lunar conditions were either impossible to obtain or of questionable efficacy. The geometric symbols he had drawn to contain the book required precise measurements and alignments that would need days to calculate properly. Moreover, Ashton had worked alone, a scholar versed in both orthodox and heterodox traditions, comfortable moving between Christian prayer and older forms of symbolic magic. Dunning, Palmer, and Worsley were, by contrast, conventional men of their time, educated certainly, but not in the esoteric arts that Ashton had mastered. We cannot replicate his work, Dunning concluded as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cathedral's eastern windows. We lack the knowledge, the materials, and perhaps most importantly, the time. The entity is weak now, driven back by the prayer's power, but it will recover, and when it does, it will be more dangerous than before, because now it knows that we are aware of it, that we oppose it. Then what do you propose? Worsley asked. He looked exhausted, having aged a decade in the course of the night. We must hide it, Dunning said, but not merely hide it in a wall or a closet where it might be found again in 50 or 100 years. We must place it somewhere truly inaccessible, somewhere that will outlast our lifetimes and those of our successors. Where? Palmer asked. There is nowhere in England that is truly inaccessible. Every old building is subject to renovation, every hidden room to eventual discovery. Dunning had been thinking about this throughout the night, and an idea had gradually taken shape. There's one place, he said slowly, the cathedral crypt, specifically the oldest section, the pre-Norman foundations that lie beneath the choir. They are flooded, have been for centuries, since the water table shifted. No one goes there, no one has reason to go there. If we were to place the book in a sealed container lid, perhaps, to resist both water and decay and sink it in the deepest part of that flooded crypt, it might remain undisturbed indefinitely. Worsley considered this. The crypt is accessible only through the chapter room, and the entrance is sealed with an iron grate. I have the key, but it has not been opened in my time here. The water below is black and stagnant, perhaps 12 feet deep in places. You're suggesting we lower the book into that? I am suggesting more than that, Dunning replied. I am suggesting we go down ourselves to ensure it is placed in the deepest, most inaccessible location. And I believe we should do it today, now, while the entity is still weak from last night's confrontation. That's madness, Palmer protested. The risk of drowning aside, if the entity should manifest while we are down there, in that confined space with no light and no escape, which is precisely why we must act quickly. Dunning interrupted. Every hour we delay is an hour in which it grows stronger. Better to face it now, in our time and place of choosing, than to wait until it has recovered its full power. After further discussion, Worsley agreed. They would need equipment, ropes, lamps, a boat or raft to navigate the flooded crypt, and a lead container to hold the book. Worsley knew of a coffin maker in the town who worked with lead linings. He sent Marsh to commission a small, sealed lead box of specific dimensions to be ready by noon. Palmer was dispatched to arrange for a small boat and the other necessary equipment, and Dunning remained with the book, reading and rereading Ashton's notes, preparing himself mentally for what was to come. By early afternoon, everything was ready. The lead box had been delivered, a grim thing, smaller than a coffin, but with the same mortuary associations. Dunning placed the book inside, wrapping it first in consecrated cloth that Worsley had brought from the cathedral's vestry. He closed the lid, and Worsley soldered it shut with a small portable brazier. Sealing the book away from the world, they carried the box to the chapter room, octagonal chamber that dated from the 13th century. In one corner, set into the floor, was the iron grate Worsley had mentioned. It took all three of them to lift it, the hinges screaming in protest after decades of disuse. Beneath was a shaft descending into darkness, with worn stone steps spiraling down along the wall. Palmer had obtained several oil lamps and a small collapsible boat of the type used for duck hunting. They lit the lamps, and Dunning, carrying one, began the descent. The steps were treacherous, slick with moisture, and in some places broken or missing entirely. Behind him came Palmer, carrying the lead box, and Worsley brought up the rear with the boat and additional equipment. The air grew colder and damper as they descended, and soon Dunning could hear water lapping below. The lamplight revealed glimpses of the wall's ancient stone, far older than the cathedral above, carved with symbols that predated Christianity. This had been a sacred site long before the monks built their church. Perhaps that was part of the reason Ash had chosen Barchester. For his dark work, the steps ended at a small stone landing, and beyond it stretched a vast, flooded chamber. Dunning held his lamp high, but its light penetrated only a few yards into the blackness. The water was utterly still, a perfect mirror reflecting the lamp's flame, and it gave off a smell of age and decay. They assembled the boat, a rickety affair that inspired little confidence, and loaded the lead box into it. Dunning and Palmer would row. Worsley would remain on the landing to guide them back with his lamp. "How will you know where to place it?" Worsley asked as they prepared to push off. Ashton's notes mention that the oldest part of the foundation is marked with a particular symbol across within a circle, pre-Christian in origin. We looked for that symbol, and we placed the box beneath it. The water there should be deepest, as that was the original center of whatever structure once stood here. Palmer settled himself nervously in the bow. Dunning took up the oars, and they pushed away from the landing. The boat moved sluggishly through the black water, each stroke of the oars echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Worsley's lamp grew smaller behind them, and soon they were surrounded by darkness broken only by the single lamp that sat between them and the boat. They rowed for what seemed like an eternity, though it could not have been more than a few minutes. The walls of the crypt gradually emerged from the darkness, massive pillars rising from the water, supporting arches that disappeared into shadow above. Carved into these pillars were more symbols, more evidence of the site's ancient sanctity. And then Dunning saw it, on the largest pillar, at the far end of the chamber, a cross within a circle, carved deep into the stone and still visible despite centuries of water damage. "There," he said, pointing. Palmer held up the lamp, and they could see that the water here was darker, suggesting greater depth. This was the place. But as Dunning shipped the oars, preparing to lift the lead box, he felt something change in the atmosphere. The air grew colder still, and a faint luminescence began to appear in the water around them, not a natural phosphorescence, but something else, something that pulsed with a sickly, greenish light. Quickly, Palmer urged, "It knows we're here. It's coming." They lifted the box between them, balancing it on the edge of the boat. It was heavy, requiring all their strength. They tipped it over the side, and it sank immediately, disappearing into the black water with barely a ripple. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water began to churn, and that luminescence grew brighter. Something was rising from below, something large, moving through the water with terrifying speed. "Row!" Palmer screamed. "Row for your life!" Dunning seized the oars and pulled with all his strength. The boat lurched forward, but it was so damnably slow, and the thing in the water was fast. He could see it now, a shape of impossible geometry rising from the depths, something that his mind struggled to interpret. It was like the illustration in the book, but three-dimensional, moving, alive, and it was angry. Appendage, he could not call it an arm or a tentacle, as it was somehow both, and neither broke the surface and reached for the boat. Palmer struck at it with the lamp, and where the light touched, the thing recoiled. But only for a moment. The water around them was boiling now, and Dunning could hear that rasping exhalation, horribly close, horribly loud in the confined space of the crypt. Another appendage rose, and another, surrounding the boat, reaching inward. Dunning rowed frantically, his lungs burning, his arms screaming with the effort. He could see Worsley's lamp ahead, impossibly far, impossibly small. The prayer. Palmer gasped, "Read the prayer." But the book was sealed in lead, sunk in the water behind them. There was no text to read from, no words to speak. And then Dunning remembered. They had read it last night, had spoken it aloud. Perhaps the words themselves held power. Perhaps if they could repeat them, he began to recite, his voice shaking, stumbling over the Latin phrases. Palmer joined him, their voices rising above the churning water and the entity's rage. And incredibly, miraculously, it seemed to work. The appendages withdrew slightly, and the luminescence dimmed. Dunning rowed with renewed strength, and the boat surged forward. They covered the final distance to the landing in a desperate rush, and Worsley was there, reaching out to grab the boat and pull it to safety. They scrambled out, nearly capsizing in their haste, and ran for the stairs. Behind them, the water erupted. The entity was no longer attempting subtlety or gradual manifestation. It was throwing its full power against the barriers that contained it, seeking to drag them back, to punish them for their defiance. The ancient stones of the crypt shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. They climbed the stairs 3 at a time, heedless of the danger of falling. Below them, the water was rising, following them up the shaft, defying natural laws in its pursuit. Dunning could feel its cold breath on his neck, could hear whispered promises of torment that would last beyond death itself. And then they were through, tumbling onto the floor of the chapter room. Worsley slammed the iron grate down and locked it with shaking hands. For a moment, the water continued to rise, reaching the grate, pressing against it from below. But then, slowly, it began to recede, sinking back into the depths. The 3 men lay gasping on the stone floor, too exhausted and shaken to speak. From below came one final sound, a howl of rage and frustration that echoed through the chapter room and set the ancient timbers of the cathedral creaking. And then silence. The official record, such as it was, made no mention of the events of those terrible days in Barchester. Canon Worsley noted in the chapter book that certain manuscripts from the muniment room had been examined and found to be of insufficient interest to warrant further study. The lead box and its contents were recorded in a separate register as miscellaneous materials, consigned to the crypt for permanent storage. Those who might have questioned such a vague entry were not inclined to investigate further, particularly after Worsley let it be known that the materials in question concerned certain unfortunate practices from the pre-Reformation period. Better left undisturbed. Dunning returned to Cambridge 3 days later. His research at Barchester concluded more abruptly than he had planned. He wrote a brief note to Canon Worsley thanking him for his hospitality, and indicating that he would not be publishing any papers on the Barchester manuscripts. Worsley understood and did not press him for explanation. In the months that followed, Dunning found it difficult to return to his usual scholarly pursuits. The certainties that had previously governed his understanding of the world had been shaken. He had seen things that should not exist, had encountered evidence of realities beyond the physical and rational. His work suffered, and more than one colleague commented on his distracted manner and his reluctance to engage in discussions of medieval texts. He did, however, maintain a correspondence with both Worsley and Palmer. They wrote infrequently, never discussing the specifics of what had occurred, but checking on each other's welfare and sharing what little news they felt safe to share. Palmer reported that the disturbances in the cathedral had ceased entirely once the book was submerged in the flooded crypt. Worsley noted that the iron grate had been sealed permanently with consecrated cement and that he had arranged for the key to be melted down. It was nearly a year after the events in Barchester that Dunning received a troubling letter from Worsley. The canon wrote that there had been some discussion among the cathedral chapter about renovations to the crypt. The flooded sections were to be pumped dry and the ancient foundations either restored or, if damaged, filled in with concrete. Worsley had argued strenuously against this plan, but he was facing resistance from some of the younger canons who saw it as an opportunity to create additional storage space for the growing cathedral archives. Dunning responded immediately, urging Worsley to do everything in his power to prevent the project. He even offered to travel to Barchester himself to add his voice to the objections. But before he could make the journey, he received another letter from Worsley indicating that the matter had been resolved. One of the engineers who had surveyed the crypt had reported that the foundations were far more unstable than initially believed, and that any attempt to pump out the water might result in catastrophic structural damage to the cathedral above. The project had been cancelled indefinitely. Dunning suspected that Worsley had influenced the engineer's report, perhaps through the generous application of cathedral funds to ensure a conclusion that suited their purposes. He was grateful and relieved, though he could not entirely shake the suspicion that the structural instability might have been genuine, a final act of defensive malevolence from the entity below, preventing access to its prison. Over the following years, Dunning's career continued, though never with the enthusiasm or dedication he had once brought to it. He published occasionally, maintained his fellowship, taught his classes, but a part of him remained in that cathedral, in that flooded crypt, forever aware that beneath the civilized surface of the world lurked things of darkness and malice. He heard occasionally from Palmer, who had left Barchester for a living in a small parish in Devon, far from cathedrals and ancient foundations. Palmer's letters spoke of a simple life among simple people, of harvest festivals and christenings, and the ordinary rhythms of rural ministry. He seemed content, or at least at peace, and Dunning was glad for him. Canon Worsley lived to a considerable age, dying at 83 in 1920. Dunning attended the funeral at Barchester, his first visit to the cathedral town in more than 20 years. Standing in the cathedral during the service, he felt the weight of memory pressing upon him, but there was no sense of active malevolence, no disturbance in the sacred space. Whatever lay beneath seemed to slumber still. After the funeral, he walked through the cathedral close and made his way to the deanery garden. The old wall was still there, gray and lichen-covered, unchanged by the passage of time. He stood for a long while looking out over the meadow where they had tried to contain the book, where the entity had first manifested in its terrible form. The meadow was empty under a pale autumn sky. A few sheep grazed peacefully, and in the distance he could hear church bells marking the hour. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, giving no hint of the horror that had unfolded there so many years before. As he turned to leave, he noticed something carved into the wall near the gate, something that had not been there before, or that he had not noticed in the darkness and panic of that night. It was a simple inscription, barely visible beneath the moss: Hic iacet demon in libro requiescat in pace. Si potestir lies the devil in the book. May it rest in peace, if it can.